Were there hospitals before the Middle Ages?
Public hospitals emerged during the Middle Ages, 500–1350. As Christianity spread and religious orders set up the facilities to serve the poor. Still, most people received a doctor's care in the privacy of their own homes. The concept of a public health care facility originated in India as early as the 3rd century BC, when Buddhists established hospital-like installations. The Middle Ages saw the establishment of facilities more closely resembling modern hospital, including Paris's Hôtel Dieu. Founded in the 7th century, today it is the oldest hospital still in operation. In 970, a hospital in Baghdad, in present-day Iraq, divided physicians into the equivalent of modern-day interns and externs. Its pharmacy disseminated drugs, as well as spices deemed to have medicinal value, from all over the known world.
Why is Shakespeare widely studied?
English dramatist Ben Jonson, 1572–1637, said it best when he proclaimed that Shakespeare was not of an age, but for all time. Most teachers and students, not to mention critics and theatergoers down through the ages, likely agree with Jonson's remark: Shakespeare's canon, consisting of 37 plays, divided into comedies, tragedies or histories, plus poems and sonnets, expresses universal and unchanging human concerns as no other works have. Shakespeare's words are familiar even to those who have not studied them, not simply because of the many contemporary adaptations of his works, but because Shakespearean phrases and variations thereof have, through the years, fallen into common usage. Consider these few examples from Hamlet alone: neither a borrower nor a lender be. To thine own self be true, and the play's the thing. No other writer's plays have been produced so often or read so widely in so many countries.
What is contract bridge?
It's the game most people play when they play bridge. A card game for 4 players in 2 partnerships who bid to name the trump suit. The other kind of bridge is called auction bridge, which was invented in 1904 as a variation on the card game whist. Whist had been played since the early 16th century, if not longer. Auction bridge differs from contract bridge in that tricks made in excess of the contract are scored toward game. In contract bridge they are not. It's believed that contract bridge originated in 1926 when railroad heir and yachtsman Harold S. Vanderbilt, 1884–1970, invented the variation while on a Caribbean cruise. The game did not catch on until 1930, when Romanian-American contract bridge expert Eli Culbertson defeated Lieutenant Colonial W.T.M. Butler in a Challenge match at London's Almack's Club, the match was highly publicised.
What happened in the Rwandan genocide?
On April 6, 1994, the airplane carrying Rwandan President Juvenal Habyarimana. 1937 to 1994, of Rwanda's majority Hutu ethnic group, was shot down by unknown attackers. The event touched off, or was used as an excuse for, what one journalist described as a premeditated orgy of killing in which ethnic Hutu extremists carried out a campaign of mass murder against minority Tutsis. 10 years after the horrific events, the Chicago Tribune's Africa correspondent recounted how Rwanda's Hutu majority, equipped with machetes and called to action by government radio announcements, slaughtered neighbors, friends, co-workers. Priests killed parishioners who sought refuge in churches. Teachers murdered pupils. Hundreds of thousands of women were raped. Children burned or drowned, bodies pushed into mass graves. The massacre continued for 3 months, ending only when Tutsi fighters managed to seize the capital at Kigali and take power. In 2004, the Rwandan government released its official estimate of the death toll. 937,000 people were murdered, making it the worst ethnic cleansing the world has seen since the Holocaust during World War II, 1939–45. But, unlike the Holocaust, which was carried out by a dictatorial military machine, the Rwandan genocide was carried out by the masses. In the aftermath, more than 150,000 people were accused of participating in the massive violence. Though the Rwandan courts had only tried a small fraction of those, no more than 10% in 10 years. An estimated 2 million Hutus, many who probably feared retribution, had fled to neighboring countries after the Tutsis gained power. The genocide had happened at the hands of many. In the decades since the Rwandan genocide, Rwandans and the world have grappled with difficult and perhaps unanswerable questions.
What was the Great Northern War?
It was a war undertaken at the beginning of the 18th century that challenged Sweden's absolute monarchy and imperialism. During the 17th century, Sweden had become a power in the Baltic region, gradually bringing more and more territory under its control. Even the Peace of Westphalia, 1648, had granted some German lands to Sweden. But much of Sweden's prosperity and expansion during this period had been under the rule of Charles XI, 1655–1697. When he was succeeded by his young son, Charles XII. 1682–1718, in 1697, the tides were about to turn for Sweden. In 1700, an alliance formed by Denmark, Russia, Poland, and Saxony part of present-day Germany, attacked Sweden, beginning the Great Northern War. Sweden readily defeated Denmark and the Russians that same year. But Poland and Saxony proved to be more formidable foes. And Charles XII spent almost 7 years fighting and eventually defeating them. But the Russian army was to have another chance at the Swedish. And this time they were successful, defeating Charles XII's forces in 1709 at Poltava, Ukraine. Charles fled the country as the war continued and did not return until 1714. 4 years after that, the monarch was killed as he observed a battle, in what is present-day Norway. Much of the country's lands in the Baltic were surrendered. And Sweden's period of absolute monarchy came to an end.
Why was Macedonian King Alexander known as the Great?
The Macedonian king Alexander the Great, 356 to 323 B.C., has passed through history as a legendary figure. A reputation attributable to the fact that he conquered virtually all of the known world in his day. In effect, he was king of the world, though his tenure in that role was relatively brief. Born in the Greek city-state of Macedonia, Alexander was the son of King Philip II. 382 to 336 BC, who had risen to power 3 years earlier. He had an upbringing and education befitting a young Greek prince. Alexander was tutored by Greek philosopher Aristotle, 384 to 322 BC, and was trained in athletics and war. His studies of Greek literature and art would later combine with his skill as a warrior to produce a formidable conqueror. Inspired by Greek culture, he also possessed the military prowess and cunning necessary to spread Hellenism, Greek culture, throughout the known world. At the age of 16, Alexander began running the government of Macedonia while his father, King Philip, waged military campaigns to protect and expand his kingdom. At the age of 17, Alexander joined his father on the battlefield, where he commanded a section of the army to defeat Thebes. When Philip was assassinated in 336 BC, Alexander acted quickly to assert his claim to the throne. Having done so by 335 BC, he continued to carry out his father's campaigns, securing Greece and the Balkan Peninsula by the fall of that year. He followed this with an all-out offensive on the Persian Empire, long the enemy of Greece. Supremely courageous and confident in his own abilities as well as in his troops, which numbered in the tens of thousands. By the fall of 331 BC, Alexander had defeated the Persian army and along the way claimed Egypt. The centuries-old Persian Empire crumbled, and the young Macedonian king proclaimed himself Lord of Asia. Still, he pressed on, claiming Afghanistan, where he solidified his claim by marrying a young princess, and then India. He was poised to take the Arabian Peninsula in 324 BC when he died of fever. He was 33. His vast kingdom, which he had ruled leniently but nevertheless authoritatively, was divided among his former generals.
Why is Charlemagne so well known?
Charlemagne's popularity with history students is due not only to the ruler's great accomplishments during his lifetime, but also to the fact that these accomplishments were documented. His biography, titled Vita Caroli Magna, The Life of Charlemagne, was written by a fellow named Einhard, c. 770 to 840, who was his advisor. Charlemagne, 742 to 814, or Charles the Great, became king of the Western Franks when his father, Pepin the Short, c. 714 to 768, died in 768. Upon the death of his brother Carloman, in 771, Charles became king of all the Franks. He then went on to conquer much of Western Europe, including Saxony, Lombardy, northeastern Spain, and Bavaria. He sometimes employed brutal tactics in bringing people and regions under control. During the last 2 decades of the 8th century, he used mass executions to subdue Saxon rebellions. Charlemagne succeeded in uniting all of these areas under one empire. And on Christmas Day 800, he had Pope Leo III, c. 750 to 816, crown him Emperor of the West, thus initiating the Holy Roman Empire. As a patron of the arts, literature, and science, Charlemagne revived Western Europe, which had been in decline since the fall of the West Roman Empire, in 476. He is credited with laying the foundation for the Holy Roman Empire and the European civilization that developed later in the Middle Ages. He ruled until his death in 814.
When was modern Israel established?
As a modern state, Israel was formed by decree in 1948. In the wake of World War II, 1939-45. The United Nations, UN, formed a special committee to address the British control of Palestine. The region in the Middle East, Southwest Asia, that borders the Mediterranean Sea to the west, Lebanon to the north, Syria and Jordan to the east, and Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula, to the southwest. The narrow piece of land comes to a point in the south, where it fronts the Gulf of Aqaba. In November 1947, the United Nations, UN, carved Israel out of the Palestine region. Areas of Palestine that were not designated as Israel were divided between neighboring Arab countries. Modern Israel's first leader, David Ben-Gurion, 1886 to 1973, proclaimed an independent Israel on May 14, 1948. Born in Poland, Ben-Gurion had arrived in Palestine as a young man of about 20 and became extremely active in efforts to assert Jewish autonomy in the region. He served as Prime Minister from 1949 to 1953 and again between 1955 and 1963. But Israel's history goes back much farther than these 20th century events. And, having such a long history, it is also a complicated one. Israel was an ancient kingdom in Palestine, formed under King Saul in 1020 BC. Israel included the lands in Canaan, the promised land of the Hebrew tribes who descended from the people that Moses 14th–13th century BC led out of Egypt. But the kingdom was subsequently divided, and by the 8th century BC it had ceased to exist. Nevertheless, the area remained home and holy land to the Hebrews, Israelites, who had settled there. The entire region of Palestine, including the Kingdom of Israel, subsequently came under the control of various empires. Palestine saw the rule of the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, the Persians, the Macedonians under Macedonian King Alexander the Great, 356 to 323 BC. And the Romans. The area was the Roman province of Syria in the time of Jesus. After Roman rule, Palestine was, with only one exception, ruled by various Muslim, Islamic dynasties, including the Ottoman Empire, 1516 to 1917. It was in 1917 that Palestine came under control of the British, who proclaimed in the Declaration of Balfour to support the establishment of a national home for the Jews living there. However, Britain reversed this policy in 1939. At the same time, the area was seeing an influx of Jewish people who were escaping persecution in Europe. Jews in Palestine opposed British control, and at the same time fighting intensified between Jews and Arabs. The 1947 decision by the Union to establish a Jewish homeland resulted in nearly 2 years of fighting between Israelis and Arabs in the region. And though boundaries among the various states were determined anew in 1949, fighting in the region continued with the Arab-Israeli wars of 1956, 1967, 1973–74, and 1982. Unrest prevailed throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, when the two sides began discussions to resolve the long conflict.
When was our system for notating music developed?
The innovation came in the early 11th century, when Guido of Arezzo, c. 991–1050, an Italian monk, devised a precise system for defining pitch. Guido was a leading music teacher and theorist in his day. As such, he was invited in about 1028 to Rome, where he presented a collection of religious anthems to Pope John XIX. Guido used a system of 4 horizontal lines, a staff, on which to chart pitch, and he used the syllables ut, later replaced with do, re, mi, fa, sol, and la to name the first 6 tones of the major scale. Before Guido developed his precise method for teaching music, singers had to learn melodies by memorizing them, a process that took many years. Using his notating system, singers were able to sight-read melodies. Guido's famous treatise, Micrologus, was one of the most widely used instruction books of the Middle Ages, 500-1350.
What were penny newspapers?
Although the number of newspapers published in the United States climbed quickly during the first decades of the new republic, the decades following independence. 1783, they were not generally accessible to the common man. Priced at an average 6 cents a copy, the cost was outside the reach of the average American. The labor-saving machinery developed during the Industrial Revolution. Late 1700s and early 1800s, was instrumental in lowering the cost of the newspaper. Because production costs were lower, publishers could charge less per copy. The first so-called penny newspaper, or 1-cent paper, was published by Benjamin H. Day, 1810 to 1889. The debut issue of the daily The New York Sun appeared in 1833. The American newspaper industry was off and running. Now reaching a mass audience, publishers worked feverishly to outdo each in order to keep their readers. By the late 1800s, news reporting had become increasingly sensationalistic. Population growth, spurred by increased immigration at the end of the 19th century and early in the 20th century, meant there were plenty of readers for the now thousands of newspapers. During the first decade of the 1900s, before the proliferation of radio, invented 1895, the number of American newspapers peaked at about 2,600 dailies and 14,000 weeklies.
How was the Colosseum ruined?
The Roman structure, begun during the reign of Vespasian, ruled a. d. 69 to 79, was disassembled during the Middle Ages, 500-1350. When its stones and blocks were removed and used to construct other buildings. The Colosseum, situated in the center of the city of Rome, was a giant, outdoor theater. Between 80 and 404, it was an entertainment center where battles were staged. Gladiators competed, and men fought wild animals. It could seat 50,000 spectators who were separated from the arena by a 15-foot wall.
What is capitalism?
The cornerstones of capitalism are private ownership of property, capital goods. Property and capital create income for those who own the property or capital. Individuals and firms openly compete with one another, with each seeking its own economic gain. so that competition determines prices, production, and distribution of goods. And participants in the system are profit-driven, in other words, earning a profit is the main goal. Capitalism is the antithesis of socialism. A theory by which government owns most, if not all, of a nation's capital. There is no pure capitalist system. National governments become involved in the regulation of business to some degree. But the economy of the United States is highly capitalistic in nature, as are the economies of many other industrialized nations, including Great Britain.
When was photography invented?
The concept of still photography dates back to the 10th century when Islamic scientists developed the camera obscura. Latin for dark chamber, a darkened enclosure with a small aperture, opening, to admit light. The light rays would cast an inverted image of external objects onto a flat surface opposite the aperture. This image could be studied and traced by someone working inside the camera obscura. Or the image could be viewed from the outside of the camera, through a peephole. In the 16th century, the Italian scientist Giambattista della Porta, c. 1535 to 1615, published his studies on fitting the aperture of the camera obscura with a lens to strengthen or enlarge the image projected. Made increasingly versatile through additional improvements, the camera obscura became popular among 17th and 18th century European artists. But the camera obscura could only project, rather than reproduce, images onto a screen or a piece of paper. During the 1800s, scientists experimented with ways of making the images permanent. Among those who made advances in the photographic process were French physicist Joseph Nicephore Niepce. 1765 to 1833, who produced the first negative image in 1826, French painter Louis-Jacques Daguerre. 1759 to 1851, who in 1839 succeeded in making a direct positive image on a silver plate. Known as the daguerreotype, English scientist William Henry Fox Talbot, 1800 to 1877, who developed a paper negative, c. 1841, that could be used to print any number of paper positives, and English astronomer Sir John Herschel. 1792 to 1891, who was the first to produce a practical photographic fixing agent and the first to apply the terms positive and negative to photographic images. All of these milestones made photography a practical way of permanently recording real-life images. The breakthrough in still photography was the Kodak. Introduced in 1888 by American inventor George Eastman, 1854 to 1932. The Kodak camera used film that was wound on rollers, eliminating the glass photographic plates that had been in use. The box-shaped camera made photography accessible to everyone, including amateurs. By the early 1900s, the Eastman Kodak Company had become the largest photographic film and camera producer in the world. George Eastman has been credited with mass-producing the moment, before the Kodak. A word he made up because he was fond of the letter K, photography had largely been the domain of professionals who were commissioned to take portraits of the well-to-do prominent members of society. Once the Kodak became widely available, photographs preserved the faces of ordinary people and the events of everyday life.
What was Lend-Lease?
Lend-Lease was a plan, developed and strongly supported by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1882 to 1945, to extend material assistance to the Allied powers fighting the Axis powers in World War II. 1939 to 45, in the days preceding U.S. involvement in the war, Roosevelt argued that it was imperative for the country to come to the aid of those fighting Germany and Italy. It was similar to helping your neighbor put out a fire in his house in order to prevent your own house from catching fire and burning. Under Lend-Lease, which was passed by Congress on March 11, 1941, approximately $50 billion of aid in the form of food and supplies, weapons, machinery, and other equipment was provided to the Allied nations, primarily to Britain and the Commonwealth nations first, but later to all nations fighting against Hitler's war machine. The return of the goods was not addressed until after the war had ended. At that time, most people felt the Allies had all contributed everything they had to the war effort, and that the sacrifices made by Allied Europe in the days prior to U.S. entry into the fighting were balanced by the contributions made under the Lend-Lease Act.
Did Aristotle develop his own philosophy?
A student of Plato's for 20 years, Aristotle's ideas were unquestionably influenced by his teacher. However, Aristotle developed his own doctrine, which he applied to many subjects. Aristotle rejected Plato's theory of forms, or theory of ideas. While Aristotle, too, believed in material, the physical being, and forms, the unchanging truths. Unlike his teacher, he believed that it is the concrete, material, that has substantial being. Aristotle viewed the basic task of philosophy as explaining why and how things are, or how they become what they are. It is for this reason that Aristotle had not only a profound and lasting influence on philosophy but on scientific spirit.
How did the Aztec and Inca empires compare with the Mayan?
While all were advanced civilizations that were eventually conquered by Spaniards, the Inca and Aztec cultures reached their peaks in the 15th century, just before the arrival of the Europeans in the New World. The Mayan civilization reached its zenith about 500 years earlier, and was already in decline by the time of European incursion. Each group also occupied a different region of the Americas. where each carved out its own stronghold and flourished. The Aztecs settled in central Mexico, the Incas in western South America, primarily Peru, and the Mayas in the Yucatan Peninsula and Central America. There is evidence that they traded with each other as well as with American Indians to the north. The Aztecs founded their central city of Tenochtitlan, the site of Mexico City, about 1325. A poor nomadic people before their arrival in Mexico's central region. The Aztecs believed the Lake Texcoco marsh was a prophetic place to settle. Before they built it into a great city, they first had to fill in the swampy area, which they did by creating artificial islands. In the 1500s, when the Spanish first saw the remarkable city with its system of causeways, canals, bridges, and aqueducts, they called it the Venice of the New World. In addition to constructing the impressive trade and cultural center of Tenochtitlan, the Aztecs were farmers, astronomers, mathematicians, and historians who recorded the events of their civilization. Their religion was pantheistic, meaning they worshipped many gods. Given that, it's not surprising that when the Spanish conquistadors arrived, at first the Maya believed they were gods, or at least the heavenly hosts of their long-awaited god Quetzalcoatl, and even welcomed them with gifts. Later, the Aztec rose up against the Europeans, but under the leadership of Hernán Cortés. 1485 to 1547, the Spaniards conquered the group, claiming Mexico in August 1521. The Incas developed one of the most extensive empires in all the Americas. During the 100 years before the arrival of the Europeans, the Incas expanded their territory along the western coast of South America to include parts of present-day Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. Though it was a vast region, it was nevertheless a closely knit state ruled by a powerful emperor. The government was subdivided down to the local level. But because the emperor required total obedience from his subjects, local rulers were kept in check. Like the Aztecs in Mexico, the Inca developed an infrastructure that included a network of roads, bridges, and ferries as well as irrigation systems. They, too, built impressive edifices, demonstrating their abilities as engineers. The magnificent city of Machu Picchu was modeled in clay before construction began. The Inca were also skilled craftspeople, working with gold, silver, and textiles. Like the Aztecs, the Incas worshipped many gods. And when the Spanish explorer Francisco Pizarro, c. 1475–1541, arrived in the region in 1532, he was welcomed as a god at first. However, by 1537 the Inca were brought under Spanish control.
Was King George III really insane?
King George III, 1738–1820, suffered from bouts of mental illness during his 60-year reign. Today many believe that he was ill with porphyria. a metabolic disorder that results in excessive amounts of porphyrins, a basic substance in body tissue, blood, and urine. He ascended the throne in 1760, upon the death of his grandfather, King George II, 1683 to 1760. 5 years later he suffered his first attack of mental illness, others followed in 1788 and 1789 and in 1803 and 1804. A final and devastating attack came in 1811, it left him deranged and blind. As the popular play and movie The Madness of King George attests, the monarch's illness presented England with a difficult problem: what do you do when a ruler becomes irrational? When the king became ill in 1788, his prime minister, William Pitt the Younger, 1759 to 1806, and the Queen ran the government, dutifully protecting the king's interests even while the king's son George, the Prince of Wales, 1762 to 1830, openly associated with his father's parliamentary opposition and himself plotted to take control. Once King George III had recovered, in 1789, he reduced his official activities and grew increasingly reliant on Pitt, who proved to be an effective national leader. Pitt resigned in 1801 and was replaced by Henry Addington, 1757 to 1844, until 1804 when the king, feeling that invasion by France was imminent, asked Pitt to prepare a new government. Pitt again assumed the role of Prime Minister, a role he retained until his death in 1806. Thereafter a coalition government, sometimes called the All Talents Administration, was headed by William Grenville, 1759 to 1834, until 1807. Following that, the Duke of Portland, William Henry Bentinck, 1738 to 1809, became Prime Minister, until his death in 1809. That year, King George III participated in forming a new government for the last time. After 1811, the Prince of Wales, who would become King George IV, ruled the country as regent. Despite his health problems, King George III led England during one of the most crucial and trying periods in British history. His reign saw the American colonies fight for and win independence from Britain. The French Revolution challenge and oust royal authority in a neighboring country. Britain challenged by Napoleon's Grand Army, and the dawning of the Industrial Revolution. Further, Ireland was brought under England by the 1801 Act of Union forming the United Kingdom. Thus, George V was the first ruling member of the House of Windsor. The others were Edward VIII, 1894 to 1972, who abdicated the throne in 1936 so that he could marry American socialite Wallis Simpson. 1896 to 1986, George VI, 1895 to 1952, who became king upon his brother Edward's abdication and who would work tirelessly during World War II, 1939 to 45, to keep up the morale of the British people. And Elizabeth II, 1926, George VI's elder daughter, who still reigns as Queen of England today. Elizabeth, who ascended the throne in 1952, proclaimed that she and all her descendants who bear the title Prince or Princess are to be known as Windsor.
Mainland attacked during World War II?
Yes, the continental United States was hit twice during the war, but with no casualties and only minimal damage. The first attack occurred at approximately 7 p.m. on February 23, 1942, when a Japanese submarine shelled an oil storage field at Elwood Beach, California, about 12 miles north of Santa Barbara. The Japanese were trying to hit oil tanks there, evidently with the intent of producing a spectacular explosion. But after firing a reported 16 or 17 rounds, they had struck only a pier. Most of the shells fell into the sea, well short of their targets. U.S. planes gave chase, but the submarine got away. There were no injuries and only minimal damage. But the event put the nation on heightened alert to the possibility of more attacks. The February 23 attack took place shortly after President Franklin Roosevelt, 1882 to 1945, had begun his fireside chat, addressing the nation over the radio. He talked about how this war was different, since it was being waged on every continent. Every island, every sea, every air lane in the world. He also said, the broad oceans which have been heralded in the past as our protection from attack have become endless battlefields on which we are constantly being challenged by our enemies. The unsuccessful assault at Elwood was the first attack on mainland U.S. soil since the War of 1812, 1812-14. The event stirred fears of conspiracy and rattled nerves up and down the West Coast. There was one other strike on mainland soil during World War II, at Fort Stevens, Oregon, at the mouth of the Columbia River. On the evening of June 21, 1942, a Japanese submarine fired some 17 rounds of shells at the coastal military installation but caused no damage.
How were the Gauls related to the Celts?
The ancient Gauls were a Celtic people who spoke forms of the Celtic language. They occupied the ancient country of Gaul, a region west of the Rhine River and north of the Pyrenees Mountains, an area that today consists of France, Belgium, Luxembourg, part of Germany, and part of the Netherlands. The Gauls were led by priests, who were called Druids. By 390 BC the Gauls had moved southward, across the Alps and into Italy. In the 3rd century BC, they battled the powerful Romans and were briefly successful. Ultimately, however, they were defeated, becoming subjects of Rome. Later, under Julius Caesar, the Romans conquered all of Gaul, so that by 50 BC the region became part of the Roman Empire. 5 centuries later, Gaul was overrun by the Franks, for whom the region was named. Thus, French people today are descendants of the Gauls. Also, the Galatians, one of the Christian peoples to whom the Apostle Paul wrote while he was in jail, were descendants of the Gauls who settled in Macedonia and Asia Minor. The peninsula between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, which today is occupied by Turkey.
What was the golden age of ancient Greece?
It is the period of classical Greek civilization that followed the so-called Dark Ages of Greece, which came to an end about 800 B.C. Over time the Dorians had become more settled, and they gradually revived trade and culture on mainland Greece. The self-governing city-state, polis, evolved, including the military center of Sparta and Athens, which became a center for the arts, education, and democracy. This was the beginning of the Great Hellenic period of classical Greek civilization. Greek civilization reached its height in Athens during the mid-400s BC. A period of outstanding achievement known as the Golden Age.
What was the worst hurricane in U.S. history?
Hurricane Katrina, which hit the Gulf Coast in late August 2005. Was not only the most disastrous hurricane in U.S. history, it was the nation's worst single weather disaster. Though not the strongest possible hurricane when it made landfall. Katrina had weakened from a Category 5 storm to a Category 4 storm just before it struck the Gulf Coast. Katrina was a monster. The storm stretched about 200 miles in diameter, packed winds up to 145 miles per hour. Produced torrential rain and huge waves, spawned twisters throughout the region, and pushed up a 28-foot storm surge, a surge usually found only in Category 5 hurricanes. Katrina moved ashore on the Gulf Coast on Monday, August 29. In anticipation of the hurricane, New Orleans, which sits below sea level, had been evacuated. But there were still tens of thousands who stayed out of necessity, such as law enforcement and healthcare workers. Because they were unable to evacuate, or because they chose not to leave. Some 23,000 of those who stayed holed up in the aging Superdome Sports Arena, which was set up as an emergency shelter. The structure barely withstood the lashing winds of Katrina, which blew off portions of the dome. On Tuesday morning, after Katrina ravaged Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, before weakening as it moved inland. Officials and news reporters generally agreed that there was unbelievable damage all along the coast. But New Orleans had dodged a bullet. The Big Easy had not taken the worst of it. Gulfport and Biloxi, Mississippi, appeared the hardest hit. The devastation there was astonishing. As reports of damage began to be made, it became clear that about 90% of the structures along the Gulf Coast were destroyed and hundreds of thousands of people were displaced by Katrina. The death toll was not known, and officials conceded it would take time to determine. The storm had been so ruinous of biblical proportions. Some said that rescue and recovery would take weeks and months. Later, when the full extent of damage began to be discovered, the recovery estimates were revised to years. Later Tuesday, New Orleans' fate changed. Levees that protect the city could not hold back a swollen Lake Pontchartrain. 80% of the city filled with water, 25 feet deep. Officials and volunteers could not get flood victims out fast enough, usually plucking them from rooftops or finding them in attics, where survivors sought refuge as waters rose. The city descended into chaos and lawlessness. Heart-wrenching images of human despair filled the media, touching people around the nation. Americans responded with donations of money, goods, and time. The American Red Cross launched the largest mobilization effort in its history. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, a part of the Department of Homeland Security (DHS). The Coast Guard, also part of the DHS, and the U.S. military struggled to keep pace with Katrina's aftermath all along the coast. For all the effort, it was widely acknowledged that the government's response to the disaster was inadequate and late. On Friday, September 2, President George W. Bush said that the results had been unacceptable. He further promised to make it right. While politicians and the people spoke out on the subject, some experts said the catastrophe had simply overwhelmed the system. Emergency programs across the nation had been set up to rely on local and state response first, backed by the federal government. In Katrina's case, the devastation was so great that the localities and states either were not able to respond at all or could not respond with enough help. Federal intervention had been needed sooner and in greater measure to alleviate human suffering and protect lives. Government officials all seemed of one accord. However, the fact-finding could wait, the victims could not. Cities and states across the nation sent resources to the Gulf Coast and set up emergency centers to receive storm refugees, whose needs were immediate: water, food, clothing, shelter, medicine, healthcare, and counseling, and long-term, jobs, schools, and permanent housing. On Wednesday, September 7, 9 days after Katrina struck, the situation continued to unfold. The size and scope of the tragedy remained to be fully understood. New Orleans ordered a forced evacuation of the holdouts. The city remained flooded with toxic floodwaters as repairs were made in the levees and the hazardous water began to be pumped out. Efforts to reunite families, separated in the chaos, were ongoing. For many days, rescue workers all along the Gulf Coast had moved from house to house to find survivors. Now it was a matter of trying to identify and count the dead. The death toll was expected to be in the thousands. The affected area was 90,000 square miles, or about the size of Minnesota. Property damage was projected to be at least $26 billion in insured losses and perhaps twice that amount in uninsured losses. Katrina had also caused damages as it struck Florida as a Category 1 hurricane on August 26. It later moved into the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico and strengthened before striking the Gulf Coast. Katrina's aftermath was felt in every state of the Union. Volunteers shored up efforts to assist survivors who were being relocated in an effort to ease the burden on the afflicted region. Schools across the nation opened doors to displaced students. Fuel prices skyrocketed and natural gas and heating oil prices promised to follow, as offshore rigs and Gulf Coast refineries suffered. And most Americans worried about the government's response to the catastrophe. The disaster made an impact around the world as well, with some 95 countries offering assistance. Before Katrina, the deadliest hurricane to strike the United States was an unnamed Category 4 storm that struck Galveston, Texas, in 1900. The September 8 storm claimed at least 8,000 lives. Some estimates place the number as high as 12,000. Hurricane strength is measured on the Saffir-Simpson scale, where Category 1 is the weakest. With sustained winds of at least 74 miles per hour and a storm surge of 4 to 5 feet above normal, and Category 5 is the strongest. With sustained winds of more than 155 miles per hour and a storm surge higher than 18 feet. The United States has been hit by 3 Category 5 storms since record-keeping began. The first was a Labor Day hurricane, which struck the Florida Keys in 1935, 408 people died. The second was Camille, which hit Mississippi and southeast Louisiana in 1969, claiming 256 lives. Hurricane Andrew, which struck South Miami-Dade County, Florida. In late August 1992, was measured as a Category 4 storm at the time, but the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Agency (NOAA) reclassified it in 2002 as a Category 5 storm. Andrew claimed more than 100 lives and devastated a wide area, mostly around the town of Homestead, Florida.
Was despotic Romanian leader Nicolae Ceausescu brought to justice?
In the 1989 trial of Nicolae Ceausescu, 1918 to 1989, and his wife Elena, 1919 to 1989, justice may not have been served. But many believed the tyrannical communist leader of Romania had indeed met with just desserts. The December 25 trial of the Ceausescus lasted all of 60 minutes. 55 minutes of questioning, to which the president's response was, "I do not recognize you, I do not recognize this court," followed by 5 minutes of deliberation. The court and judge were made up of the leaders in the popular rebellion that had begun December 16 when a pro-democracy rally attended by some 350,000 people ended in the Romanian armies and Ceausescu's secret police attacking unarmed demonstrators, killing several hundred men, women, and children. In demonstrations that followed, the Romanian army, long resentful of the privileged status enjoyed by the president's secret police, turned on Ceausescu's government. handing over automatic weapons to insurgents, whom they now joined in a popular uprising. On December 21, state television and radio came under the people's control, as did the Communist Party's central building and the Royal Palace, which were later found to be replete with luxuries and were also connected by a maze of tunnels. The Ceausescus and a few of their close associates tried to flee, but were captured on December 22, the same day that mass graves were found, revealing the secret police's torture and destruction of several hundred men, women, and children. The rebels drove the Ceausescus around for 3 days, averting the still loyal secret police. Realizing that time was not on their side, the captors assembled an extraordinary military tribunal in a small schoolroom at an army barracks. A defense lawyer was provided for Ceausescu. Council urged the former president to plead guilty by reason of insanity. He refused. The charges against Ceausescu included genocide, the massacre of demonstrators, and subversion of the economy for his own benefit. 1 hour later, the guilty verdict was delivered. Asked if they wished to appeal the decision, the Ceausescus remained silent. They were promptly taken outside, where a squad opened fire on the former president and his wife. Videotape of the brutal killings. The squad had fired as many as 30 rounds, was shown on Romanian television. By December 30, the country was controlled by rebel forces.
Why did the Hindenburg use hydrogen to keep afloat?
The fact that Hindenburg used hydrogen might have been the airship's only flaw, and it was made necessary by the political climate of the time. Hindenburg was the fulfillment of German airship designer Hugo Eckener, 1868 to 1954, whose Zeppelin company had enjoyed years of experience and success even as other airship companies folded. By 1934, Eckener felt that his successful Graf Zeppelin, which had made several transatlantic trips, was not well suited to such long-distance flights. Eckener envisioned a larger and speedier vessel. In the Hindenburg, which took her maiden flight on March 4, 1936, Eckener's vision was made real. Named for the German war hero and politician Paul von Hindenburg, 1847 to 1934. The immense airship measured 803 feet in length and had a diameter of 135 feet, allowing it to hold nearly twice as much gas as other airships. The vessel was equipped with the latest technology, including 4 Daimler-Benz diesel engines that allowed it to travel as fast as 85 miles per hour. Hindenburg was also a luxury liner. It featured private cabins, showers, dining room, promenade decks, picture windows, and even a pressurized and sealed smoking room. Cigarettes, pipes, and cigars had to be lit using an electric lighter. Matches were strictly forbidden on board. But there was one problem: Hindenburg had been designed to be lifted by helium. However, the gas was scarce at the time, and the United States refused to sell any to Germany, which had been taken over by national extremist Adolf Hitler, 1889 to 1945. The American government suspected the Germans might soon have military plans for their airships. Thus, the Hindenburg was forced to use hydrogen 7 million cubic feet of the flammable gas.
What were Captain Cook's discoveries?
British navigator Captain James Cook, 1728 to 1779, was one of the world's greatest explorers. Commanding 3 voyages to the Pacific Ocean and sailing around the world twice. From 1768 to 1771, aboard the ship Endeavour, Cook conducted an expedition to the South Pacific, where he landed in Tahiti, and made the first European discovery of the coasts of New Zealand, Australia, and New Guinea, which he also charted. In 1772 Cook set out to find the great southern continent that was believed to exist. He spent 3 years on this voyage, which edged along the ice fields of Antarctica. On his last voyage, which he undertook in 1776 on a mission to find a passage around North America from the Pacific, Cook charted the Pacific coast of North America as far north as the Bering Strait. He met his death in 1778 on the Hawaiian Islands. Cook's voyages led to the establishment of Pacific Ocean colonies by several European nations.
Which was the first TV network?
It was the National Broadcasting Company, NBC, founded November 11, 1926, by David Sarnoff. 1891 to 1971, who was then president of Radio Corporation of America, RCA. Sarnoff, considered one of the pioneers of radio and television broadcasting, created NBC to provide a program service to stimulate the sale of radios. In the 1940s he reorganized the network to provide TV programming, again to stimulate sales of RCA products, this time, televisions. It was Sarnoff who demonstrated television at the World's Fair in New York in 1939. Next came Columbia Broadcasting System, CBS, on September 26, 1928, which was established by William S. Paley, 1901 to 1990, an advertising manager for Congress Cigar Company. Paley sold some of his stock in the cigar company in order to raise $275,000 to buy into the beleaguered United Independent Broadcasters, which controlled Columbia Phonograph, hence the name. He built the floundering radio network into a powerful and profitable broadcasting organization. The American Broadcasting Corporation, ABC, television network was last. In 1943, it was only by government order that the third network, ABC, was created at all. In 1943, when RCA was ordered to give up one of its 2 radio networks, it surrendered the weaker of the 2, NBC Blue, which was bought by Edward J. Noble, the father of lifesavers candy. In 1945 Noble formally changed the name to the American Broadcasting Company, which 3 years later began broadcasting television from its New York flagship station.
What happened to the tablets on which the 10 Commandments were written?
Chapter 32 of the book of Exodus explains that while Moses was up on Mount Sinai receiving the 10 Commandments from God, the Israelites who were waiting below grew impatient, and soon prevailed upon Aaron to make us a god who will be our leader. As for the man Moses who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has happened to him. And so Aaron did what the people wanted. He proceeded to collect gold jewelry from the Israelites and then fashioned the jewelry into a golden calf. When Moses came down the mountain, he saw the people rejoicing and dancing before the calf. Enraged, Moses threw the 2 tablets, which were inscribed on both sides, to the ground, smashing them. Later, the Bible explains, in Exodus 34:1-4, that God instructed Moses to carve new stone tablets like the other ones, which he did. These tablets were placed in the Ark of the Covenant, as God had told Moses. People sometimes see the 10 Commandments as divided into 2 groups. The first group covers the relationship between people and God, and the second covers relationships among people.
When did the exploration of space begin?
The space age began on October 4, 1957, when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, later referred to as Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite. The world reacted to the news of Sputnik, which took pictures of the far side of the moon, with a mix of shock and respect. Premier Nikita Khrushchev, 1894-1971. Of the Soviet Union immediately approved funding for follow-up projects. And leaders in the West, not to be outdone by the Soviets in exploring the last frontier, also vowed to support space programs. 4 months later, the United States launched its first satellite, Explorer 1, on January 31, 1958. Not only had the launch of Sputnik initiated the space age, it had also started a space race. The Soviet and American programs would continue to rival each other, with one accomplishment leapfrogging the other, for about the next 3 decades.
What was the Sioux Uprising?
The uprising took place in August and September 1862 in southwestern Minnesota when the Sioux there suddenly had been made to give up half their reservation lands. Their situation was made worse by crop failures. While the government debated over whether it would make the payments it owed to Indian nations in gold or in paper currency, the Sioux were also without money. The U.S. agent at the Sioux reservation refused to give out any food to the Indians until their money arrived from Washington. The Sioux people were hungry and angry, and white observers could see there was trouble coming and warned the government. But the situation soon erupted in August when 4 young men having a shooting contest suddenly fired into a party of whites, killing 5 people. The Sioux refused to surrender the 4 men to the authorities, and, under the leadership of Chief Little Crow, c. 1820 to 1863, they raided white settlements in the Minnesota River Valley. A small U.S. military force sent out against the Sioux was annihilated. Meantime, white settlers fled the region in panic. On September 23, Minnesota sent out 1,400 men who defeated Little Crow at the Battle of Wood Lake. The raids had already claimed the lives of 490 white civilians. 33 Sioux were killed in the fighting with the military, while most of the Indians who had taken up arms fled to the Dakotas. The government began to round up native men who were suspected of participating in the campaign against white settlers. More than 300 men were tried and sentenced to death, many of them on flimsy evidence. Episcopal Bishop Henry Whipple, 1822–1901, interceded in their behalf, making a personal plea to President Abraham Lincoln, 1809–1865. The bishop was able to get 265 death sentences reduced to prison terms. But 38 Sioux men, accused of murder or rape, were hung in a public ceremony on December 26, 1862. The Sioux reservation lands were broken up, and the remaining Sioux were dispersed. Minnesotan nevertheless continued to man military posts in that part of the state for years to come. The events during and after the uprising were brutal for both sides. But many observers had seen that the treatment of the Sioux was going to lead to conflict. One missionary, after witnessing the harsh way the policy with the Indians had been carried out, wrote to Bishop Whipple, saying, "If I were an Indian I would never lay down the war club while I lived."
Is Stravinsky the 20th century's foremost composer?
The Russian-born American composer Igor Stravinsky, 1882–1971, is certainly one of the greatest composers of the 20th century. Stravinsky wrote concerts, chamber music, piano pieces, and operas, as well as ballets, for which he may be most well known. Between 1903 and 1906 Stravinsky studied under the great Russian composer Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, 1844–1908. In 1908 Stravinsky wrote his first work of note, the orchestral fantasy Fireworks, which was in honor of the marriage of Rimsky-Korsakov's daughter. The piece caught the attention of Sergei Diaghilev, 1872–1929, of the Ballets Russes, who invited the young composer to participate in the ballet company's 1910 season. Ballets Russes had dazzled audiences the year before, bringing new energy to the art form. In collaboration with Diaghilev, Stravinsky went on to create masterpieces The Firebird, 1910, Petrushka, 1911, and Rite of Spring, 1913, among them. The partnership served to elevate the role of the ballet composer in the art world. Rite of Spring is either Stravinsky's most famous or most infamous work. It was first performed by the Ballets Russes in the third week of its 1913 season. The choreography was arranged by the famous dancer Vaslav Nijinsky, 1890 to 1950. But the performance stunned both the music and dance worlds. So extreme was the audience's reaction to this premiere work that a riot nearly broke out inside the theater. Stravinsky had composed his music not to express spring's idyllic qualities but rather its turmoil and dissonance similar to childbirth. Nijinsky paired Stravinsky's composition with complicated and visually frenzied dance movements, later characterized by the composer as a jumping competition. Though many thought it a disastrous performance, when the Ballets Russes continued to London, Rite of Spring was more widely accepted there largely because the audience had been duly prepared for it. The following year, Rite of Spring was performed in concert in Russia, but the reaction was mixed. The young composer Sergei Prokofiev, 1891 to 1953, was in the audience and later wrote that he had been so moved by the work that he could not recover from the effects. Listeners today are still moved by the elevated rhythm of Rite of Spring, which makes an entire orchestra into a kind of sustained percussion instrument. Ultimately, most musicians and critics came to regard the watershed work as one of the finest compositions of the 20th century.
What is Title IX?
Considered one of the biggest successes of the modern women's movement. Title IX is part of the Education Amendments of 1972, federal legislation that prohibits any school or college that receives federal funds from discriminating on the basis of sex. The law applies to all aspects of education, including admission, athletics, and curriculum.
What happened to Athens after the Peloponnesian War?
At the same time that Athens was under attack from Sparta, the city-state also suffered a terrible plague, beginning in 430 B. C. The plague killed about a third of Athens' citizens. This contributed to Athens' eventual defeat at the hands of its Spartan rivals during the Peloponnesian War. After the plague had claimed so many lives, Athens simply couldn't muster the military leadership and strength that it needed to defeat the increasingly powerful Peloponnesian League. At the end of the fighting, in 404 BC, Athens was in ruins. Sparta became the dominant city-state in the Greek world. But conflicts continued among the city-states, and Thebes eventually defeated Sparta in 371 BC. As a result of the ongoing warfare, the Greek economic conditions declined, and the gap between rich and poor widened. The public spirit that had been the hallmark of the golden age of Greece disappeared. In short, the city-states were no longer the glorious entities they had once been. While the Greek city-states were in decline, Greece's neighbor to the north, Macedonia, was growing more powerful. In 353 BC, Macedonian King Philip II, 382 to 336 BC, launched an attack on Greece. The war that resulted did not end until 338 BC, when Greece was finally conquered. The Macedonian victory was only the first part of Philip's plans. He believed a combined Macedonian-Greek army could defeat the powerful Persians. But he was not to see this happen. When Philip was killed by a Macedonian in 336 BC, he was succeeded by his 20-year-old son, Alexander, 356 to 323 BC, a man history would come to call the Great. Alexander carried out his father's plan to invade Persia. And 2 years after Philip's death, Alexander began a 10-year campaign that ultimately conquered the Persian Empire. By the time he was 30 years old, Alexander had conquered much of the known world, expanding his empire from Egypt to India.